to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization, projects, and processes, giving you insights to recovery and avoiding corporate mortality events. Today, we'll be talking about how to align digital strategies to avoid failure. And joining us to contribute to the conversation is Jonathon Hensley. Welcome, Jonathon.
Jana, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, can you share a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I've been in the digital transformation and product space for close to 25 years now, and I'm also the CEO of Emerge, which is a digital consultancy where we help startups and Fortune 100 companies around the world develop their product strategies and help them bring those products to market.
So let's define a little bit what a digital strategy is, because I think that can mean many things to many people, especially with the term flying around all the time about digital transformation. So when you talk about digital strategies and digital solutions, can you tell us a little bit what you mean?
Absolutely. So I think you're hitting on something that's always really important to bring clarity around, which is many times strategy can be confused for plans or goals or ambitious visions, if you will, of what to come. When we think about strategy and the foundations of great product strategy, we're really anchoring it to understanding what problems are we prioritizing and going to solve? In what manner are we going to effectively approach and solve those problems with the resources and constraints we have as an organization? And then how are we going to move those into action in a competitive and differentiating way that will help us distinguish ourselves in the market? And so there's some pillars to that effective strategy that really have to be anchored to enable the success of any organization, no matter how large or how small. And it really comes down to kind of five foundational components, which are one, what is that vision for the product? What's that long-term destination? Understanding the problem that you're solving with that product, so you understand the impact of that problem on your audience, and by solving that problem in a more effective way than maybe an existing solution alternative your audience has, how you can actually create value, and what the outcome needs to be of that success for both the customer and the business, and then how you're going to measure that forward progress. So these things become really essential if you're going to have an effective strategy that drives organizational change and delivery.
And I often find where companies seem to drop the ball, though, is that handoff between strategy and execution. So what do you see in that space around how do companies actually realize their strategy?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues that come up consistently when we see that challenge happening. Fundamentally, the issue is an issue of misalignment that's happening, and it can come up in multiple ways in an organization. But that typically is this foundational root cause of why there's a gap between what that strategy is and the actual ability to execute on that intention. If you kind of peel back the layers and you really look at that, though, there's some key things. One is, how do you define what a good strategy or great strategy is? What does that have to encompass? And one of the key things is you have to be able to provide the clarity and focus necessary for the organization in order to move forward with definition of the solution. And so many times, one of the foundational pieces that's missing in good strategy is this idea of really clearly understanding the problem space. What are you actually solving, and what is the impact and value of solving that problem at all for your audience? And are you solving it for the right audience potentially as well? So really, what are the stakes of that problem or impact for the audience? And so many times what we'll find out is that a company will have an intuition or an idea or maybe a piece of insight that will drive a strategy, but they haven't effectively diagnosed the problem to understand what's going to be required to solve it. And so they've exited that problem space and they've moved into ideation, into the things that are really exciting, or they have an idea that they think is a solution. And they've skipped these fundamental steps that have now set up multiple areas of misalignment across the organization that are going to cause ineffective delivery and missed expectations, and oftentimes result in complete failure.
And so, what's the best way to, I guess, kind of sit in the problem long enough? How do you know when you've really evaluated it effectively versus glossed over it too quickly?
Well, I think you got to be able to ask yourself some, just basic questions, honestly. What is the problem? Can you clearly define it? Do you understand, is the problem you're looking at a root cause, or is it a symptomatic issue of something else that's happening? Who's the audience that's most impacted by that problem? And are they willing to pay for an alternative solution? Is that problem big enough for them to solve it? And is that problem worthy of an organization to adopt that product or service to initiate that change? If you can't answer any of these with absolutes, then you probably haven't spent enough time in the problem space. And then it needs to go even further. Do you have not just an understanding, do you have empathy for that audience? Do you really understand the ramifications and impacts of that problem? Do you understand where value can be created and what the exchange of value might look like, whether that be money, time, attention? It can come in many, many forms. But that's a basis for all of the other critical decisions that need to be made through the process. And then being able to prioritize very effectively the focus areas of how can we bring emphasis to solving this problem in a way that lowers the barrier to entry for initiating the change that we're asking for a customer to take. So like a good example is, if the switching costs for somebody who maybe is an iPhone user who is an Android and wants to become an Android user, that can be pretty significant. And that's by design in many cases as well. So if you're looking to initiate change between these audiences, you really have to understand how you're going to create more value for that user and make that transition as painless as possible. That's a real product problem for any organization to solve. And if you're going to introduce a new device or a new feature built on top of those devices, this isn't just one of many possible examples where you really have to understand how are you going to differentiate and connect with your target audience in a meaningful way. And one easy example of that is that's often missing up front is we don't understand the psychological value that we need to create. We're so focused on the features and the benefits of those features, we're losing sight of the connection that's necessary to initiate the change and the actual adoption of the product itself.
So yeah, it's funny. My husband tried to switch to Android. We were all Apple users with Apple like MacBooks, and that lasted about 3 months because it was so painful. Like that like being able to mess the same way of messaging groups of people, and some of those little benefits that you don't even realize Apple keeps close at hand, or anyway. So yeah, that's funny. One of the questions though that comes to mind. Is sometimes you have competing, I guess, stakeholders or competing needs that maybe even appear to be conflicting or opposing. So how do you kind of work through what your different stakeholders need and reconcile those needs?
Yeah, I think it's really important. This comes down to somewhat of a couple of key things. One is there a clear and shared understanding of the vision for the initiative or the product or service that's being created? If there's not that clear long-term destination, why it's important, understanding how it's going to be measured and what that looks like, that is an initial usually sign that there is misalignment, and it's going to be very difficult to manage stakeholder opinion on that, because that vision should be set by the leadership of the organization, and that needs to be established into the priorities of the company as it goes forward, if they're going to commit any amount of significant time and resources to resolving that. And so oftentimes clarity and focus of that strategic vision itself is paramount in managing stakeholder expectations. I think the second one is understanding what is the actual organizational culture and what are the actual interdependencies that are taking place to manage expectations. And the highest performing digital transformation and product companies, everyone understands and is their how they drive or impact customer lifetime value. And so that has to overcome individual or divisional priorities or this idea of building things within, a business function. And it's a very difficult thing sometimes for some organizations to have a realization that what's happening in my function of the org is maybe not as important as what needs to happen for the org as a whole. And so you need that to have that shared knowledge and understanding within the culture itself in order to enable that change. Otherwise, you often do see that conflict with stakeholders. The other one that we see really often is lack of actual customer connection and insight. And I think it's really important that stakeholders become part of that process of engaging with customers and hearing firsthand what's going on and build that customer empathy. So the highest performing organizations and the best stakeholders that are moving these initiatives forward are ones that will roll up their sleeves and participate in the process at the right times in order to have that connection. So it's not secondary. Executives and stakeholders especially often are deep subject matter experts around the business or industry that they're in. They are, one of the value that they can do is provide great decision making off of sometimes little to no information. But when it comes to aligning stakeholders, there needs to be a common ground that is established. And one of the best ways to do that is to make sure that there's that connection with the end user or customer that you're serving.
So how do you balance that with kind of this neat sense of urgency to drive quickly, like this, if we don't move quickly, we're going to lose market share, we're going to fall behind, etc. So but if you build the wrong thing, the same thing could happen. So how do you kind of balance that, spending enough time with driving forward quickly and executing quickly?
I think that speed is something that is often not well understood in that context. I think actually speed can be extremely dangerous. And on the flip side, it's one of the skills that an organization has to build. If you don't have the muscles and they're not trained to move quickly, effectively, and collaboratively, then your chances of failure are pretty high, even with the best of intentions. And I've seen brilliant teams come together with the best of intentions, trying to do really thoughtful, good work and still fail because they're trying to go too fast and they're looking for, these quick wins for the organization. And so you have to be really careful about that. And it's difficult if you make assumptions and sometimes what can happen is we introduce our biases into the process and we assume that if we go quick and we can do it this way, that will, yield the outcome we want. Or maybe we've adopted a corporate mantra around, fail fast, fail often. We just need to keep iterating and learning. And that has to be understood of what the actual intention of that idea is. That comes from a culture of experimentation and from a culture of adaptive learning and continuous feedback loops. And if the organization does not have that in place, moving fast is a really easy way to fail quickly with sometimes catastrophic costs. And so it's really important, I think, to assess what is your capabilities as an organization to move fast. Do you have the corporate muscle, if you will, built into the culture? Do you have the expertise and the discipline? Have you, flexed those muscles and worked them enough to really be able to build the capacity the organization needs to have in order to move that initiative forward quickly and effectively into your work streams? Otherwise, many team members are not going to be set up for success, and expectations are going to become very difficult to manage.
Yeah, and with some of that, I mean, that kind of touches on agile methodology, and like you said, it's definitely a muscle. You don't just if you're doing experiment like the experimentation, or you're chunking up work to get value out sooner, it has to be done thoughtfully. Do you find though, it I mean, how do you find that, how effective are companies actually doing it? And are they creating issues for themselves at all with meeting expectations of stakeholders? Like, are stakeholders getting that value? Or does it end up just taking just as long because we've iterated so many times that it takes a long time to actually get to solving the problem?
I think it takes really strong leadership if you're going to iterate and you don't have the skills and capacity built in the organization, because sometimes the actual value that you're trying to create erodes over time through iteration, and you have then end up having a lot of cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, that
Mm-hmm.
are trying to contribute. And that can be difficult if you don't have extremely strong leadership that can say, this is the core value we've committed to creating, and this is who we're creating that for. And we need to ensure that there's a process that we're, whether it be feedback loops or testing or whatever that method might be, through that iteration to gain feedback and step out of the shoes of being the creator or the maker in this scenario, and making sure that the actual outcome you're working towards is being effectively developed, and the path is being set up for success to get there. So one of the things that I love Agile as an example, but I've seen Agile be implemented in many times, and they think it's an opportunity where they can skip some of the key planning work that's necessary in the strategic work, and that is not the intention of Agile. The Agile is built on top of great strategic, work, and then effective planning that then enables that agility to take place. And so again, it becomes like, how strong is the organization and being able to operate that way. The other key thing about an organization, and this kind of comes back to the cultural side of whether or not they can drive the success of that kind of working model, is how comfortable are they working in an iterative process without absolutes. And so many times what we see is organizations really struggle. They want, I need a plan, I need a budget, I need to know if that budget's going to get me these deliverables, and I hope it gets me these outcomes. And that's not the intention of Agile. The Agile model, or iterative model, is really based around continuous improvement and iteration and testing. So it's not working on absolutes. So you have to be able to be comfortable working without those absolutes, and recognizing that the outcome is the most important thing. The way we get there might be different than we think. And so we have to be adaptive, and we're going to have to iterate and adjust. And maybe we put something into the market, or we test it with customers, and they're telling us we have to go a different direction, or we recognize that maybe it's not really going to create that competitive advantage that is necessary, and we weren't able to really identify the core attributes that we're going to change, or our resources aren't going to be able to actually accomplish the outcome in the way that we thought. So we need to adjust that expectation to maintain that competitive advantage. And so many times, if that cultural understanding and comfort is not there, and the organization is more comfortable trying to work with those absolutes, then it's just a huge challenge in being able to really adopt those more iterative and fast-paced approaches.
So I think you've kind of touched on a few things here, but maybe there's a nice little recap of when you look at projects that, these digital projects that fail, or product strategies that fail. What are some of the key elements that you're seeing then that drives that failure? I think you've mentioned alignment, and it sounds like, the maturity of your processes, but are there other things that really, themes that you're seeing?
Absolutely. I think some of the biggest things that we see is, I touched on this a little bit, but not really knowing your customers. And what I mean by that, in the sense of, you might have great profiles or personas and connections with existing customers, or if you're building a new company, or you're developing that idea of who that ideal customer is. What I'm more speaking to is, what are the actual behaviors and motivations for that customer to adopt or have a need for your product or service. So going beyond kind of the demographic or psychographic information of that customer and really understanding what drives that behavior and that connection with them is really important. And we see that often is missing. And it's just a level of work that is just a necessity to drive success of these projects. I think the other one is management of expectations. I think that oftentimes we see there's a lack of a common knowledge or understanding around an idea, and it really slows down the organization's ability to collaborate and really iterate on these things effectively. And so a really good example of that is, if I talk about customer experience, that could have very different meaning to different people in an organization, or it could mean very different things across companies and how it's been defined. And we see that across sectors. When I talk to a technology company talking about customer experience, or I talk to a healthcare provider about customer experience in relation to patient care, they have very, very different levels of understanding around what that represents. And if across your organization that shared understanding is different, it often will lead to potential failure because you're constantly reworking and trying to build that understanding with one another versus working on solving the problem effectively that you're trying to create, and then eventually being able to operationalize that. So we see that happen a lot.
Mm.
Siloed knowledge is another one that comes up a lot, and there's several more, but those are some of the big ones that happens often.
We obviously do a lot of project management work at project genetics, and that's actually we do a lot of recovery projects, and that's a huge one that I've seen is keeping people siloed till the end, and then you find out that now you have to change a bunch of things or respond to those conflicting needs, and it just blows the project out by 6 months or more from what I've seen.
Yeah, that happens all the time in these digital projects that we see as well, and we often end up coming into you know uh, new engagements where we've seen a client. They said, we've been trying to do this for a year or more. Help us understand what does a great strategy look like? How do we effectively design solutions to serve needs, not just the functional needs, but the psychological needs of
Mm.
customers? And so that's a really important thing to differentiate as well as you know cars is a really good example of that. If you think about like a company like Volvo versus Toyota, they both make cars essentially, right? That can get you from point A to point B, but in many ways they're nothing alike, and they're not really competing for the same audience often. And I don't think that's very well understood. So from a psychological value perspective, Volvo is known for safety, and that's the core psychological value they sell, and they make sure is imbued into every single product that they make. And if they miss that, it's not an authentic product to the Volvo brand. Toyota, on the other hand, safety is a given. They have to provide a great, safe product, but what they're really selling to their customer is the psychological value of reliability. And what does that mean?
Mm.
And so they can be developing maybe very similar products with some overlapping features, but at the end of the day, they're selling to a core audience that values and is motivated by something different. And so that's really important if you want to understand about any product. If I'm coming into a market and I understand, you know, how I can be competitive, it's a powerful asset. I mean, you look at companies like Southwest Airlines, they really were able to look at the psychological value that they could create as an new coming airline when they came into the market, and they built a brand around that love for flying, and that streamlined all the decision making that helped them really identify what are the attributes we have to have imbued into our service offering in order to live that through for our customer, which is completely different in how they looked at both how they provided the experience in the terminal from how you actually, turn time on for flights and the way they operationalize that service offering. So these are really key things in driving, I think, great product.
And so how do you think that you even I see companies fall into this trap of trying to be everything to everyone and not really having that strong definition like you're talking about. So how do they figure out what's in the box and what's out of the box and have those honest conversations with themselves? I mean, I guess
Well, I
before you
think,
get there, like I think
yeah.
like a perfect example is Kmart, right? Kmart tried to be compete against Walmart and Target, which were trying to be very two different things, right? Walmart was making things accessible to everyone, while Target was trying to have this more, quality, still reasonably priced, but we're driving quality and experience, a good shopping experience. And then when Kmart went after both, that's when we, 20 years ago saw them kind of tank, right? So things like that. How do they do good definition there?
Yeah, that, I mean, it's, so I think that one thing that there's a quote that I love. It's this idea of an enterprise that is war with itself will not have the strength or focus to survive and thrive in today's competitive environment. And so, when you talk about focus and
Mm-hmm.
this idea, I think it's, this idea of what you need to focus on is really you have to understand, what is the value of that product or the business? What business are you in essentially? And being able to pick like what attributes are we competing on? And
Right.
I think what happens oftentimes is you come into an industry or maybe you've been in an industry for a while and you benchmark yourselves against your peers. And that often happens. And what happens is this issue of industry think. So most people are familiar with the idea of groupthink or kind of group bias, but there's, broadly speaking, in a macro level, we have this issue of industry think. And so we look at a Walmart or we look at a Target and we say, well, what are they doing? We should do something similar because it's
Right.
successful. And that's exactly why they fail,
Mm.
because they're not going to be Target and they're not going to be Walmart and they can't compete in that way. They need to understand what attributes can they compete, what area of the market is not being represented, what value can I create within that the market that is demanding a provider, that has a big box store location that can handle that kind of customer base, and what markets do I need to be focused in where maybe Walmart is not. Walmart had a brilliant idea. We're going to expand into small towns and regional areas, and we're going to expand out. And that was one of their key things. They found a whole slew of or underserved customers within those areas, and they could consolidate, that experience with the value of how they constructed their supply chain. So that was brilliant on Walmart's part to do that. To try
Well,
to do that now against Walmart would be, the amount of money you would have, and even if you could do it successfully, would be astronomical. And
but
I
to
think you
take
actually see this right.
yeah, but to take theirs a step further, like the brilliance was also they went into markets where it couldn't support more than one, so nobody else could go. Like,
Right.
you couldn't have a Walmart and a Target in small town USA, because it wouldn't have survived. One of them wouldn't survive.
Absolutely. And then they, in those small towns, in especially middle America, had very specific, buyer preferences. And they understood that. They understood, this goes back to that first piece of, they understood the motivations and the behavior of, these small towns, and they really went after connecting with that in a meaningful way. And that drove a lot of their success and continues to do so. I think when you want to compete, you need to, again, come back to this idea of, if we understand our customers, now we have to pick what attributes, where can we focus?
Hmm.
What capabilities do we have that we can do better than anybody else, and in a unique and differentiating way, because we don't have maybe the same resources to compete at the way that a Walmart can compete against us. And so we have to be innovative. And that's, I think, the genius of, any entrepreneur who wants to come into a space and, be disruptive in some fashion, is to say, well, what can I provide in a different way? And because this is different than Walmart in this way, there's a whole group of people that are really looking for that kind of experience. And so we see this across industries. And I think it's one of the great things of why you can have so many competing organizations that can be thriving because they recognize they're not really competing against one another
Mm.
as much as they are needing to compete for, understanding the true motivations of the customer and finding that unique attribute.
Mm.
There's a company called Rackspace. They're a data center company. They provide managed hosted services. When they took on this kind of approach, they really were brilliant in understanding, well, a lot of people, what they really want, their idea was, our core product is going to be peace of mind. So how do they provide that for managed services? They're going to charge more money than their average, competitor. They're going to, but what they need is they need to be able to pick up a phone and talk to somebody who is in that data center managing their services directly, who has been empowered to fix something or make an update and change and needs to happen
Mm.
right then and there. Instead of these long call trees and systems that you'd get redirected to or self-service and with the emphasis of automation was great, but that doesn't actually create the peace of mind that's necessary when you have a critical system in your business that is dependent on your partner.
Mm.
And so they did a brilliant thing. They redesigned how they provide customer service support. They became famous for this idea of fanatical support. And if you call them in 3 rings, you're guaranteed to get a person on your team who can help you solve your problem. They've been empowered to solve those problems. They're not just taking in ticket information. They can actually work and start solving those problems right then and there. And it's brilliant. And it helped them grow to be a multi-billion-dollar company and incredibly successful because that peace of mind for a lot of businesses is worth every penny. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you're looking for the value solution or the self-service solution, I mean, Amazon's famous for building, AWS, and that's a massive self-service infrastructure, which is incredibly powerful, requires a very technical, and proficient audience for the most part. That's great. That's the perfect solution for those that are the do-it-themselves community, which is very engineering centric. But if you have a CTO who needs to know that they can sleep at night and know these critical systems and are going to be secured and protected, that managed service might just be the best service they could possibly ask for. And
And
it just helps, provide that clarity necessary to focus in the market.
and then it's interesting because then even Microsoft has their own spin of like making it all integrated. And so while maybe all their solutions are not the most ideal, the fact that they all work together makes them, for instance, like Slack is a far superior product to Teams. But the fact that Teams is just, it's a whole package and it's there, it's like, oh, well, can we survive with using Teams? So, but same with Microsoft Azure, right? Like, I think that's one of the challenges AWS is even experiencing is the fact that Azure, is it within that whole Microsoft ecosystem. But yeah, it's interesting to see who finds the key problem to solve and keeps it within their strategy boundaries and not try to jump out and be that everything to everyone. You were talking a few minutes ago about ones that you've seen that have failed. I don't want to assume the opposite is true, so I'm going to ask the question: what are kind of the key attributes of people who or organizations that run these effective strategies? Again, I think you've talked about quite a few of them, but if you just want to hit some of those highlights of what really helps companies be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have touched on a lot of these, but just to reiterate, I think a lot of the key things that we see that are consistent with high performance and successful companies, and especially when you talk to product leaders who haven't been successful just once, they've beaten the odds. They're doing it again and again, consistently being able to deliver that value. You see that they have really clear and well-defined product visions for their as the anchor to their strategy. So it's clearly defined, it's measurable, it's long-term, usually 5 to 7 years out. And it's something that really gives everybody very, very clear sense of what is true north, where are we going, and why does it matter. Second, they're building teams in an organization where everyone understands that they have a stake in customer acquisition, participation, retention, and support. Doesn't matter if you're in the back office and you're helping with HR, you understand that your job is potentially to empower that team to be able to do those things. And there has to be that consistent connection that's being made. And it has to be reinforced. It's a core cultural element in these companies that we see is consistent. The other one is customer experience is always equated to customer lifetime value. It is not this one thing that is tied to an initiative or a team that's kind of off to the side. It's an umbrella, and it's an anchor to everything, that the way that they think and operate. Especially when it comes to tech, this becomes just an incredibly important piece, because we're always, from a technology perspective, we're trying to accelerate time to value when we're creating digital products and services. So this becomes just essential. And then I think it's really getting clear on what those value drivers are that we talked about before. It's like, what's that psychological value? And then what is the actual functional value of that product or service that the organization is providing through, it's this, whether it's, a car manufacturer, an airline, or a small business. It's really important to understand what that is, because if you understand what that is, you can avoid critical issues around fragmentation or disjointed messaging, or having products that start to fracture and separate from the actual core of the business that are maybe now pulling the company down. And then it's really getting to this attributes piece we talked about around that. What is that service? What are those attributes, these unique things, rack space, making sure somebody's there to pick up the phone in 3 rings, and knowing that you can trust that that'll happen. As one example. And then really tapping into, do I really know my customer? Do I really have a relationship? When we talk about it's all about relationships, well, what does that mean? Do I really understand what motivates them, what keeps them up at night, what drives that behavior? And that's really hard work. And frameworks and models don't do enough. They give us a starting point for a lot of this work, but they're not the actual end all be all of this work. So if we fill out these frameworks, we adopt these templates, they're not going to give us the solution. They just help us make sure that we're not missing potentially a critical piece of information, or a way to look at information in a powerful and unique way that allows us to make better decisions. And so we really have to make sure that we're doing that groundwork and really spending time to get to know our customers in that way.
And just for clarifying, I think, and sometimes correct me if I'm wrong, but you use customers a little bit interchangeably, that they could be internal customers or they could be like actual external customers. Is that the case?
That's totally true. And I appreciate for you calling that out and that differentiation. So in the work that we do specifically, about half of the work is actually internal for employees, and about half is customer facing external. So, but the approach is the same, whether it's a small business or team, or a organization that's 65,000 employees, you take the exact same approach.
It's been great. Thank you, Jonathon. So it was a really interesting conversation. Kind of in closing, what kind of 3 things do you want to leave top of mind for our audience today?
I think that one thing we touched on that I think is really important to bring back is it's important, I think, for every organization to really develop that muscle and that clear understanding of the difference between strategy and understanding planning. And a lot of times today, those things are even combined together just from a terminology or kind of, buzzword perspective, right? It's strategic planning. Well, no, it's either planning or it's strategy. We can argue about semantics, but the skill set is different for real strategic work, which is understanding the problem space so we can figure out where to focus and make the biggest possible impact with our resources and capabilities as an organization. Versus planning, which is that once we understand that, how are we going to effectively manage those resources and bring alignment to our team so we can execute on these things. And so I think really making sure that you're developing that skill set and really embracing that, I think is just absolutely invaluable for any organization.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other one that's really important is making sure that there is a common language and understanding the organization. I think that leaders especially have a huge responsibility when it comes to this. I've seen CEOs of Fortune 500 companies go around and do this, where they really spend months talking to employees, talking to customers, so that they can make the right decisions at the right time. So they're really connected and not removed with all of the structure, but actually really, immersed in what's happening in the market that they're serving. And
Mm.
I think it's really important to have that connection in common language. Every industry has its own acronyms and shorthand and way of working and terminology that we love to use, but we all hold that differently. And I think especially when you have such a diverse and wide range of people that are working together to do great things in an organization, you really have to put extra effort in that to empower them to, when we say our people are our best asset, the most important thing we have to set them up for success. And that shared understanding of what these things mean and why they matter are really important. And we can't take that for granted. It really sets us up to do better product, better innovation, and drive better transformation, so that we can get through these very complex, initiatives successfully together. And then I think last but not least is really, I can't overemphasize the importance of knowledge management.
Mm.
When you have so many brilliant people in an organization, they can come and go, whether it's just a life change and they're starting a family, they've decided to move, maybe there's been another event in their life, and it's just they're now no longer able to be a part of maybe just the project, or they've moved on career-wise altogether. Knowledge management is this incredibly powerful thing that allows you to scale really effectively. And if you can have really good, clear, line of sight for every role, where everybody knows why their work matters, how their work contributes to the organization's success, and they can understand what value they bring, and you can manage then the knowledge to enable one another so they have an understanding and appreciation for each other, you have the opportunity to overcome most hurdles that result in failure of these initiatives.
Those are great. Thank you. How can people get in contact with you or learn more about what your organization does?
A great way to stay connected is to go to emergeinteractive.com. We've got a great tons of resources in our insight section if anybody's interested in digital transformation and product. I'd also recommend that anybody, if they're interested, to reach out to me on LinkedIn. That tends to be the best way to connect with me. And then also, if they're interested in any of the things that we've been talking about today, I'd encourage them to go to Amazon and check out my book, Alignment: Overcoming Internal Sabotage and Product Failure.
Great, great. Thank you so much for your time today, Jonathon.
Thank you so much for having me, Jenna. It's been wonderful to talk to you today.
Yeah, and to our audience, until next time, keep your organization.
Hey!